another strong and well-resourced movement coming from the discipline of philosophy, effective altruism, which argues that the way to solve global poverty is to go into finance, make a lot of money, and give away most of your money. Again, I think we can save for later criticisms of these approaches, but I start with them just to point out that if sociologists don't come up with better ways of addressing global poverty, others out there will come up with ways that seem to us incomplete and naive, or maybe even harmful, and maybe even dangerous. So, what does sociology know about solving global poverty? In this talk, I want to highlight 3 different approaches in sociology of development, what they say about how development happens and how it could be nudged along, and what the open research questions and policy challenges are. So to develop this talk, I read every article in every issue of the Sociology of Development journal. There's only 10 years, so most of the people who write in that journal are in this room today. So I hope when we get to the interactive part of this plenary, we'll have a good discussion. So the first approach is, of course, the developmental state. If anything qualifies as orthodoxy in the sociology of development, this is it. So the idea here was, of course, to examine what some states, such as Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, were able to do in the mid to late 20th century to experience very rapid development. The answer that many scholars gave was that well-coordinated state action can spur economic growth by mobilizing firms to take advantage of market opportunities, in this case, export opportunities. This line of work descends from Alexander Gerschenkron, who argued that countries that were later to develop could only do so with the help of the state. In the Sociology of Development journal, this research agenda is alive and well. You see, for example, Andrew Schrank discussing the norms and behaviors that lead to meritocracies, which lead to development. Clark and Kaysen ask if exporting is the answer, when do countries experience favorable terms of trade? Bort et al. Examine developmental state capacity, and Halima Tusaidia shows state capacity affects maternal mortality. This literature is now being taken into new directions, such as on the question of climate change. Summer et al. Show that meritocratic hiring, firing, and promotion lead, for example, to less forest loss. Now, one thing we have done in this conference is we've tried to get a lot of practitioners involved. So you'll see that in many of the sessions, we've tried to have practitioners as discussants. We also have 2 practitioners plenaries tomorrow. And the idea here is to see program that could affect people around the world. And one very exciting branch of research on the developmental state that is starting to do that is this question of how do you get a developmental state? One strategy that scholars have taken is to examine specific state institutions, that is, to disaggregate the state into the specific organizations that constitute it and ask if they're able to deliver what they're supposed to deliver. In the very first issue of the Sociology of Development journal, Alejandro Cortez wrote an article arguing that the developmental state literature needs to move past countries as the unit of analysis and needs to examine specific institutions at subnational level. And there is, by now, a very exciting literature that points out that even in the least well-governed states, there are always some isolated organizations became the life of the top developmental states. This literature goes under various names: islands of integrity, pockets of excellence, proto-bureaucracies. This is both an intellectual advance on the idea of developmental state, and it's a practical suggestion for policy action. Use the expertise that sociologists have on organizations to understand how to make a better public sector organization. And I want to point particularly to the work that Rina, who is here somewhere, is doing on this issue on effective public sector governance in the Global South, as an example of how the scholarship tries to use sociological insights to bring about real-world change. Now, the classic developmental state literature, or the institutional literature more broadly, was criticized and continues to be criticized for many reasons. There continues to be debate about how important state action was. There's criticism from meritocracy. There continue to be arguments that corruption is good for growth. I'm personally not convinced by any of these critiques, and we can follow up why not in the Q&A. But for our basic purposes here, I just want to mention a couple of critiques and open questions that I think are more compelling. One is the question of what exactly should the developmental state do? The classic recipe was to niches, but we have suddenly taken a protection. There is a question of flipping through the pages of the journal, I found myself wishing that there were an article called "Is Export-Led Industrialization Still the Answer?" But there is not such an article yet so far. The second critique of the developmental state is about the political economy of the developmental state, and specifically that these meritocratic bureaucracies in the East Asian countries were operating after extensive land reforms that being carried out. That question, I think, is very compelling. It brings us to the second main sociological approach for solving great poverty. That's global social capturing a range of articles that I see in sociology that are global in two ways. First, they're cataloging what there are some who, while not necessarily explicitly advocating revolution, argue very strongly that no change is possible from within the existing system. There are others who like the developmental state literature precisely because it offers promise to be impractical solutions. That's a quote from Albany says. For those who think revolution is the answer, the Sociology of Development Journal offers something for you too. For example, Ali Kadivar examining the social developmental consequences of the Iranian Revolution in conversation with the work of Kevin Harris. And I know at this point this is sounding like an extended advertisement for the journal, but I promise they didn't pay me. There is really good stuff in the journal. Meanwhile, for those who are not revolutionaries, one way forward is to draw out the lessons of existing social democracy. I've argued, and others have argued, that the main lesson of existing social democracy is that it was most successful when social democrats were most concerned with keeping economic growth going. Polanyi wasn't right about everything, and in the 80 years since he wrote, one thing we have learned is that some kinds of welfare spending are conducive to economic growth, particularly but not only spending on education and healthcare. That continues to be a thriving research area, but we need more studies from beyond Europe, and we're starting to get some. For example, in the journal, Roberts and Brundage focused on how national redistribution policies affect income inequality between and within countries. If we're thinking about global economy, we also need to know how to build social movements and what makes social movements effective. And my colleague Beverly Silver's work helps us to conceptualize and answer questions like that. But we need much more work with engineer scholarship in social movements and scholarship on economic development outside of the US and Europe. I also want to point out some interesting articles in the journal that put together rather than calling the first method the developmental state with the second, Polanyi. For example, you have Paul Almeida arguing that the development state created the mobilization infrastructure for social movements against neoliberalism. And Christopher Gibson does something similar. And then lastly, under the global Polanyi heading, we have to think about the possibility of global welfare states, which seems at first an oxymoron, as how can you have a global welfare state when we don't have a global state? But as we know, if we have read our Frida Scotch poll, it's not just the case that states create policies, it's also the case that policies create states. It's in forging global redistribution that institutions of global governance may come into being. A case in point is the recent and increasing success of government in developing countries arguing for climate reparations. Of course, this effort has been a total failure in every way, except in comparison with what went before. In comparison to what's gone before, it's been a startling success in that developed countries, for the first time, have agreed unanimously to redistribute to developing countries, not just as charity, not just as foreign aid, but for harms caused. Okay, so states are one answer. Social movements pressing states are another answer. The first answer was given in the very first issue of the Sociology of Development Journal by Alejandro Cortez. The second answer was also given in the first issue by Peter Evans, who asks the big question of how societies transform and gives a Polanyian answer. It's being carried forth in the journal as well, especially this global welfare state idea. Noy and McManus argue that globalization leads to increasing health spending, and Liam Swiss argues for thinking of foreign aid as a transnational process of political globalization, while Shriwise et al. Conceptualize universal social protection. We have Gershon, Krohn, and Polanyi. For the third answer, I want to go back to randomized controlled trials and effective altruism. We are quick to criticize these efforts in sociology, but we don't often ask, what are these efforts, sociologically speaking? They're philanthropy, of course, but I think they're also something else. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Marxists thought the working class was the agent of historical change. The idea was more about structures than agents. The development of capitalism put the working class in the key position to bring about change, according to this theory. In the latter part of the 20th century, social scientists pointed out that states are pretty significant actors in their own right. And that's why sociology of development has such a statist flavor. But RCTs and effective altruism, I want to contrast two stories. The first story is of Sam Bankman-Fried. Most of you are probably familiar with him, but for our foreign audience, Bankman-Fried was a very smart young man who got advised by his professors at MIT to do effective altruism. That's what they said you can do the most good in the world by doing, by going into finance and giving away most of his money. So he became seriously committed to this. He developed a crypto exchange, became a billionaire many times over. People used to say that he would someday be the world's first billionaire. He did give away a lot of his money. He also seems to have convinced himself of his own moral purity to such an extent that he borrowed customer funds for another company he founded, was eventually caught, is now in jail. There's some question about whether he was ever serious about effective altruism or just found it a convenient cover, but critics of effective altruism point out that even if you're serious about it, just making as much money as you can means everyone is going to go into finance. If everyone's going into finance, of course you'll get clever shenanigans like this, because the competition gets stronger and stronger. You have to do weirder things and take crazier risks to make the big profits. And of course you tell yourself the big profits are necessary so you can do the most good. So stories like this make us cynical, right? The second story is one you might not have come across yet. It's about Pastor Chuck Mingo. His story is told in a new book by my colleague Hari Han, who's the director of the Agarwala Center at Johns Hopkins. She came across him because she was examining something unusual that had happened. In 2016 in Cincinnati, voters approved a tax increase that would benefit primarily poor Black children. Tax increases in America are, of course, an uphill climb, and tax increases that benefit the poor and minorities are unpopular everywhere, even in social democratic countries. But Hari Han found that in 2016, even Trump voters voted for this initiative. She traces the success to the efforts of a church in Cincinnati called Crossroads and its pastor, Chuck Mingo, and a program he developed called Undivided, which tried to get church members talking across racial divides. It had some successes and some failures. It was very successful at getting voters to the polls to approve this tax initiative. I won't go into detail on the story, you should read the book, but I want to draw one thing out of these two examples, Bankman-Fried and Mingo, which I think constitutes the third sociological approach to solving global poverty. Both of these people, and everyone who does RCTs and effective altruism, have anti-poverty careers. Despite their very different effects, they're coming out of similar places. They're coming out of the fact that capitalist societies are so rich that larger and larger proportions of those societies can spend their time doing things like dreaming up RCTs and effective altruism and Undivided's 6-week training program. They afford, that is, many people the luxury of having these careers in which they produce attempts at ameliorating poverty. Of course, some people have always had anti-poverty careers in religious institutions, for example, but the wealth of the contemporary world, the inequality of the contemporary world, communications and transportation technologies that make the poverty of the global poor visible to the global rich, all mean that such careers are a factor now in the world that they have not been before. And I'm suggesting, and many others have suggested, that it's perhaps now strong enough and substantial enough to rival the power of states and social movements. If you think of the amount of money going to microfinance, for example, which came neither from states nor from social movements nor from the working class, it's easy to think that perhaps there's a new social power developing. people with anti-poverty careers exist in the academy. I'm looking at about 100 of them right now, but they also exist in corporations and nonprofits and government agencies. They are, by their function, oriented to reform rather than revolution, and to working within the system rather than depressing the system from outside. But it's also the case that these are real careers with real demands on them. And yes, this third approach was also signaled in the very first issue of the Sociology of Development Journal in an article by Jocelyn Materna, Emily Clow, and Killian Clark on civil society and the third sector. That was quite an amazing first issue. So you see this approach in articles such as by Setsuko Matsuzawa, who examines how donors are influenced by local dynamics, or Joseph Harris, who shows how professionals in developing countries champion healthcare, or Sophia Boutillier, who studies development. I'm not sure who the patron saint is of this third approach. It's maybe Durkheim combined with Jane Addams combined with Weber. The research agenda for this third approach is clear. It's to separate out the Chuck Mingos of the world from the Sam Bankman-Frieds. And one lesson from Chuck Mingo is that he's doing strategy too. He's building a social movement to push state action. You can also draw the lesson that he's successful because he manages to unite a community around the need for this change, which is the lesson my colleague Hari Han draws. But another lesson I draw from the comparison is that Mingo can do this because he has an anti-poverty career. He has the luxury of doing this. The problem, what the Bankman-Fried example is telling us, is that anti-poverty careers lack accountability. There is currently no infrastructure that tells Sam Bankman-Fried that he's going in the wrong direction. There's no infrastructure that tells other people how to become or imitate Chuck Mingo. And there's no infrastructure that tells academics that although they started out trying to solve poverty, they may not be doing anything to get closer to that goal. Even RCTs, which claim to have accountability built in, don't really have the kind of cohesive accountability that I'm talking about, as there is no sustained discussion about how RCTs fit into broader development efforts or whether they are adding up to change. There's really no evidence for evidence-based research right now. It's very easy, therefore, to enter a career thinking you're going to do something about poverty and then end up privileging the demands of the career rather than the problem solving. So in terms of both an intellectual question and a policy question, that's the question before us. And that's where the Johns Hopkins Center on Global Poverty comes in. We might or might not be able to change the world, but we can focus the attention of those of us in the discipline concerned with solving poverty to actually trying to solve it by creating that structure of accountability, to try to orient all these people with anti-poverty careers and channel them into directions that are doing something about poverty. That's the research agenda and the policy agenda. In sociology, in particular, we want to solve poverty, but we often end up only describing poverty and critiquing others' efforts to solve it. But we have so many resources to draw on within the sociological canon about how change happens. It's not always put together in a way that would be useful for practitioners, but we're hoping that this conference, which brings together academics and practitioners, can help to kickstart something new. I was just teaching Vivek Shiver's book Locked in Place in my undergrad class, and I think a couple of my undergrads are actually here. Shiver argues that the secret of the developmental state is nodal agencies, which are the government agencies that coordinate all the other government agencies. We need an intellectual nodal agency, which is what I hope this center at Johns Hopkins can be. So in closing, let me put up this table. In the developmental state, poverty declines because of economic growth, and growth happens because a capable state is able to exploit opportunities. Usually opportunities in world export markets, but this could be generalized to economic opportunities in general. And this is a sort of medium-term strategy for change. In global social democracy, poverty declines because of redistribution within the state or redistribution across states. And there are some kinds of redistribution that do not come at the expense of economic growth and may even help economic growth. And this, especially the idea of the global welfare state, is a long-term strategy for change. In what I've called anti-poverty careers, poverty declines in small ways, piecemeal and incrementally, one program at a time, sometimes in concert with states and social movements, sometimes working with the third sector of NGOs. And the big appeal of this third strategy is that there is an immediacy to it. It can often bring immediate benefits. But I've also emphasized that these careers are a bit of a wild card right now, unless and until we can get them under control. And this is why I think our conversation has to begin there. And I will end there and turn it over to Rina and Beverly.
Are really good at identifying problems, and we are less good at turning ourselves to a problem-solving orientation for those problems. So if my first question is, should sociology get into the business of solving problems, I would say absolutely yes. I would love to do so. Of course, the question is how to do so. So I'm just going to put forth a few very random thoughts. I did not read Jen Year's articles in preparation for the talk, and I hope this is just in the spirit of discussion. So as I've been hearing more from Monica about what a problem-solving sociology would look like in the arena of this big field of global poverty, I'm still trying to gauge it with Burrowwood's public sociology. I'm trying to understand what's the difference, what are the similarities. And one thing I was wondering is, we kind of know how our critical sociology might affect the public sociology, but could a critical sociology also shape a policy sociology, or maybe what we could call a practitioner sociology? Is it possible, especially I would love to hear from the practitioners, is it possible to take our very critical sociology where we love to criticize, where we identify lots of problems, what are the ways that we can turn that into something concrete, even in the policy world? And so I think one way, and as I was thinking about the answer to that, I'm of course thinking about what in the world would this Hopkins Center do, and what would it look like? And one approach is what I think Monica has laid out for us, is we can go through all the sociology literature and make a sort of running list of the tons and tons of very unique solutions that sociologists have been able to document. So we sort of articulated solutions that we don't see in economics, we don't see in political science, and Monica went through a number of them: the developmental state, global social democracy, social movements, revolution. I didn't put the career solving poverty thing because I'm not sure they have solved it yet, but that could be up here, and then we could go on. I mean, there's a lot more that people have also done in sociology. We've done a lot of work on totalitarian participatory democracy, decentralization, solidarity economy, and we could kind of go on thinking on documenting different solutions that sociologists have come up with, and then in order to then turn it over into our problem-solving orientation, we in the center or in this group can then think how do we then turn the wheel? How do we make a public institution more effective? How do we make a social movement pressure the state? But as I was thinking about this, I think probably there are a number of sociologists, as Monica said, many of them in this room, that are really good at answering these questions. I have to say I'm not. I am not so skilled or able to get into or maybe even, maybe I'm also not motivated by the job of going into the nitty-gritty of how a public institution can be made more effective. So I was trying to think, okay, well, what else can sociologists bring to the table? I think one group could very well do this. What else could we do, and what makes sociology unique compared to the other disciplines? And as I was thinking of it, I thought one thing sociologists spend a lot of time doing is not only articulating the solutions, but articulating the conditions under which that solution actually thrives or fails. In our dissertations, we often say, okay, a really quick starting point is just say, I'm going to look at under what conditions does a particular solution succeed or fail. So then we can say under what conditions does a developmental state succeed or fail. So not getting into the nitty-gritty of the developmental state, but looking at the broader structure around the developmental state. Under what conditions does an institution or a social movement flourish? And what obstacles can kill an institution or social movement? I think sociologists have done a great job at articulating those conditions. And so then our job, as if we go into the problem-solving orientation, would be to articulate how then do we attain those conditions? How then do we avoid those particular obstacles that sociologists have put forth before us? A second thing I thought sociologists could easily do, and do all the time, and I think would make a huge contribution to problem-solving sociology, is our methodology. So when we look at RTCs or effective altruism, they're actually not solutions, they're methodologies to find solutions. And so when we have economics offers this methodology of RTC, and as we know, it's attained a lot of legitimacy, and as I was speaking with Patrick Heller, we were saying, yeah, it's attained a lot of legitimacy, but it's among a very particular group. It's got expert legitimacy or technical legitimacy. Effective altruism is also a sort of methodology of solving poverty. It doesn't actually say what the solution is, it's just a way to get there. And perhaps this has attained a lot of legitimacy to legitimize the sort of private compilation of wealth. And so then what is it then that sociologists bring to the table? Well, of course, sociologists bring ethnography, interviews, and surveys. I think sociologists are extremely good at exposing, hearing, seeing what is happening on the ground. We're really good at answering questions like, how are different actors seeing the same things differently? What do different actors actually want? And what kinds of politics are actually taking place on the ground? And perhaps most importantly, why is this particular poverty alleviation project not working? And so I think what sociological methods could offer a problem-solving sociology is a promise of popular legitimacy. We might be able to actually articulate what a certain population actually wants and attain consent for a particular solution, or help attain consent for a particular solution. And I don't know, we were in the morning panel with Kirk Heaney. I mean, yet he was presenting unbelievably beautiful, but also heart-wrenching sort of evidence from his research of quotes on how migrant workers actually experience their labor cycles, something that is not necessarily apparent or even articulated by them or their families or their communities. So what is it then that we can do with that methodology? Finally, I was wondering if sociologists could make use of their sort of comparative advantage in identifying problems. Like I said, I think we're really good at identifying problems. Actually, that's why I moved from economics over to sociology, is economists were always solving a problem, but then they got the problem wrong, so of course the solution was wrong. And then you go over to sociology, and they actually understood the problem. And I can't help but to think we need to not just move away from that, but actually use that comparative advantage and figure out how to translate that into a so-called solution. And one of the problems that at least I have really deeply appreciated that sociologists are always sort of articulating and identifying is relations of power. We're really good at explaining in a system who benefits, who loses. We're good at articulating what kinds of power are actually operating, visible and invisible forms, economic forms and cultural forms, hard forms, soft forms. We're good at identifying where it is and where can we escape it. Where are the small oases where that power actually doesn't extend? We know people find those oases. What can we make? Can we make use of those oases? When did it emerge and when did it fall? Because power does fall. It comes from above and we know it comes from below, as Monica's also pointed out with social movements, revolutions. And how was it produced in the first place? But also, why is it consistently and constantly reproduced? That is an important question that we ask, and we give really important answers. So I was thinking, if I take, Monica, your starting point, you have these three solutions that sociologists have come up with. Sociologists and others have sort of identified the mechanisms through which that solution works. And then we can go through some how-tos on those mechanisms to attain those solutions. But if we add power into it. And I'm not saying everyone has to do that. I'm just suggesting that what if we had a center where one sort of group within that center addresses issues of power? We could maybe look into the question of what made that developmental state, or what made what made that developmental state so capable, what made that public institution so effective, under what conditions does meritocracy work? Well, we have to look at how did the state get the power to discipline capital, another finding in Vivek Chibra's book. That South Korea was able to have a state that could discipline capital. India failed to do that, and therefore failed to have a capable state or a strong developmental state. We have to understand, how does the state get that power to suppress its landed elite? I think with the developmental state literature, we have to understand it in the context of the rising power of the US and structural adjustment policies. How did Japan, the Japanese government and the Japanese unit and the World Bank get the power to not only enforce a developmental state, but then articulate it as an alternative model? How did they get that power? Can everyone articulate an alternative model so successfully? And finally, to what extent did social movements have power or fail to attain the power to reshape the developmental state? Similarly with global social democracy, I think another insight of Polanyi, of course, is that the power from above causes power from below, if below is squeezed hard enough, and that power from below can come from the left and the right, as we know today. So what are the ways that we can either prevent the power from above from squeezing too hard? Are there things that we can say and convince policymakers of? Or is there also ways that we can ensure that one group's power wins over another group's power, from the left and the right, an inclusive power rather than an exclusive power? And finally, when we look at anti-poverty careers, I guess that ultimately this is really showcasing the power of finance today. And I would ask, how did we come to a situation where we have empowered individuals over institutions, over states, over social movements? And what other kinds of power are enabling these anti-poverty careers, which, as you said, are piecemeal, heterogeneous, and totally unaccountable, lack of accountability? Thank you again, Monica.
I'm going to pick up and expand on a few things that have already been raised. I don't know, and then I'm going to, and I'll add a couple of other things. But let me start from the global Polanyi question. So some initial readings of Polanyi particularly back in the 1980s and 90s, were a little bit overly optimistic readings, leading to an expectation that neoliberalism would be much less tenacious than it has been, that a counter-movement would come about more quickly and effectively and bring us back toward a situation, or back, this is a thing that I'll develop later, but anyway, that we'll be in a situation of a move toward precious commodities as being sociologically essential to solving global poverty. Without the protection of land and nature, there's no protection of human beings, and there's no solution to global poverty. So I had first done like a long 20th century table where in 2008 I had put a solid arrow going back. It was showing the pendulum swing between protection of fictitious commodities and protection of capital, right? So between this protection of profitability, an emphasis on protection of profitability, protection of capital, or an emphasis on protection of labor. And I have put a solid line back for the protection of labor. And then over the next, I don't know how many years it took me to change the solid line to a dashed line, and then the dashed line just to a question mark. So rereading Polanyi, there's many key sentences which would have led one to be a little less quick to put solid line. And one of them that I kind of come to appreciate, because there are two sides to the sentence. And the sentence reads, unless the alternative to a given social setup is a plunge into utter destruction, no crudely selfish class can maintain itself in the lead. So the optimist reads that sentence, no crudely selfish class can maintain itself in the lead. And after a while, I realized, that the key part of the sentence, at least to understand where we're at today, is unless the alternative to a given social setup is a plunge into utter destruction. So he's not saying that no crudely selfish class can maintain itself in the lead, or that there's an automaticity or any kind of thing to an effective double movement that would protect humans and nature, but that the alternative to that is a plunge into utter destruction, which I think explains a lot about our current situation. So I think, so the fact, that we're at where we're at today, and I think, this economic crisis, war, fascism, environmental crisis, I don't know how this, I think it is rooted in this strength of this extremely selfish class. I don't know, ruling class. I don't know. I wanted to do some comparisons with the past to see whether they're particularly more venal ruling class, than the previous historical analogous periods, but I don't know. And I don't know how this makes us think about effective altruism, because like on the one hand I'm saying, okay, effective altruism becomes certainly better than the purely selfish ruling class, but exactly what the mechanism is from whether it's actually, anyway, Monica already raised some of the questions involved there. So I think one of the there are a couple of points that I wanted to elaborate on, moving back to some of the issues that Monica raised and that Rina elaborated on. But one of them is this question of the linking the global Polanyi to the developmental state, and the nature of the institutional changes at the level of the nation state that are necessary to go from double movement, institutional transformations, solving poverty, or at least alleviating poverty. And what are the conditions at national level for effective Polanyian double movement? I wanted to, while we're all doing shout outs to Hopkins panel, I wanted to do a shout out to our colleague, Sophia Edwards, who's just finished a book that will be coming out very shortly on Trinidad and Tobago, which takes the movement from below side, but not like some magical kind of black box between the movement from below and the solving global poverty, but shows how the emergence of this strong liberation union movement, which was rooted in the Black radical tradition, was able to push the state to expand institutional capacities in particular ways to meet demands from below. So very much showing the pathway, right, and the conditions under, to get back to what Rina was talking about, conditions under which that pathway from double movement or movement from below to solving global poverty can happen. Monica mentioned the sociological literature on successful land reform, which I think we definitely need not to lose sight of. Sometimes it's the result of social revolution from below the land reform. And I think this is like a nod back to something that was also said, that sometimes it was, land reform came about, there was some reference to Japan at one point, but was essentially allowed from above by the United States as a means to head off the communist revolutions in the context of the Cold War. So I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but one of the things I think that we tend not to bring in centrally in thinking about global poverty, or even in thinking about development, is the geopolitical context. And I'll come back at the very end to some of the questions, the geopolitical questions. So, as was already mentioned, I think we're all tend to be familiar with that Polanyi, when he talked about the double movement, it didn't just take progressive forms, it also took, it was one part where he talks about in one breath fascism, communism, and the New Deal. And one thing I wanted to point out, and this will get me back to my two final points. One is about global economic institutions, and the other is about global political or geopolitical institutions and their relation to the issue of solving global poverty as opposed to local poverty, right? Is that all of these forms of the double movement historically have also been conducted through major boundary drawing processes, meaning that solving poverty for some has been based on excluding others from the social compact. So it's pretty clear in kind of classic fascism, contemporary efficient kind of fascist type movements, that addressing, or at least the rhetoric of meeting demands and the policy of meeting demands from below are very explicitly based on excluding the other, right, from those rights to livelihood. But even if you go look at the New Deal, and the role of the GI Bill, for example, so the benefits that went to veterans from fighting in the Second World War, now in the United States, right, that on one level, obviously women were excluded from the benefits, or most women were excluded from the GI Bill benefits, but also African Americans were very largely excluded from the benefits of the GI Bill due to real estate, residential segregation, redlining, etc. So even things that we tend to think of as progressive and good, right? But of course we know. I'm not telling anything that people in this room don't know. But the problem is that and I guess maybe the broader methodological question is how do we move up and down in terms of levels of analysis or units of analysis or that sort of thing. So the point that I want to make here is that Monica set out the remit, it doesn't say solve poverty, it doesn't say solve local poverty, it says solve global poverty is the remit that she set out. Then we need to come to terms with this question of boundary drawing and, and the boundary drawing itself, it's not, it's a systemic problem, right? It's not, there might be normative feelings that one has about it one way or another. But there's something fundamental, and from my point of view, that I have, and I think that we need to bring in central to the discussions of solving global poverty, is this fundamental contradiction between profitability and legitimacy. Because that's where the boundary drawing comes from, is this attempt to square the circle between maintaining profits and maintaining social legitimacy. And we should go back and look at the crisis of the 1970s, or the way in which the developmental projects came into crisis. In shorthand to me, that it was a moment where this contradiction between profitability and legitimacy just kind of blew up. And then we didn't know for a decade or so which direction this contradiction was going to be resolved in, and now, we had 40, 50 years of it being solved on the side of capital, right? So now we're back. So what I would say is, I've got 2 minutes left, so let me say, solving global poverty, I think, It needs to be, and this has been mentioned, but I'll kind of hammer it, we need to think about the global institutional arrangements. Even if we go back to the Bretton Woods institutions as they were established right after the Second World War, they were set up on the premise that states had the right and duty to pursue macroeconomic policies that would promote full employment and reduce poverty. So all this developmental state stuff was happening in a global institutional framework, particularly earlier on. Finally, this is my landing, sticking the land. It's a joke. It's the gymnastics. Yeah. Okay. So it's the global. I should have. That always mistake to some go off on a tangent. Okay. Somehow I'm talking about global political institutions, and I guess I'm losing the transition to this point, but the point I wanted to end on, and something that we don't talk about a lot in sociology, a little bit, not a lot, but certainly I haven't seen a lot of it being related, tied to questions of poverty is the question of war. So the plunges into utter destruction, part of it is this escalating and expanding warfare, psychological crisis. So we see, on the one hand, an independent, direct impact of war on an explosion of poverty. So we only need to look at Gaza, the measures of poverty in the Human Development Index measures of mortality, malnutrition, life expectancy, education. But that's, we don't need to just look there. And so I think one of the things we want to do in terms of looking at solving global poverty is we need to think about how to move back from this expanding militarism. Corey Payne is doing, our former PhD student at Richmond University, is doing very interesting work on the underlying interests of this expanding military-industrial complex, because on the one side of the people who are being at best impoverished by war is this tremendous economic interest behind it, and so it's. I think probably was when the Russia went into Ukraine first, kind of popped back into my mind. Oh, no, it actually popped back into my mind when the U.S. in 2003 went into Iraq first. That keeps popping back into my mind. Is this poster that there was when I was a teenager, was set by this group called Another Mother Against the War, which was a U.S.-based movement founded to oppose the U.S. war in Vietnam, and their slogan was, "War is not healthy for children and other living things," and I think war is not good for solving global poverty either. So that's thanks.
We have some time for questions, but what we really wanted to use this time for was thinking about this center and how the center can help the people in this room. So this idea of a center of global poverty, it started in a workshop that we held with some of the people in this room a year ago. It's impossible to get academics to agree on anything, so we were calling it the Institution for Global Poverty, and then somebody said, well, institution is a pretentious word, and then somebody else said, well, we're not actually for global poverty, we're against global poverty, so now it's the Center on Global Poverty. I think that's what we're now. And our question really is what would be helpful for people, so we can either discuss, if people want to ask questions about anything that's been said, we can do that, or we were thinking about doing, okay, I've seen some hands, go ahead.
My question is more about growth talk. I thought it was really brilliant and insightful. And I'm thinking about what Beverly said about connections to land and nature, and what Rina said about responsibilities and technology. What you did, going through 10 years of research and catalog also very careful and like protection of land as a way of sort of dealing with the conditions of climate change and all of these threats to the future. And a lot of that, some of that may point towards a sort of approach that is anti-growth almost, and the three categories seem to be growth adjacent in some capacity. The third one, not so much, it's kind of diffuse what does that really look like, but the other are still kind of focused on the idea that, like, you know, in sort of dealing with this like right, where our sociologists, development sociologists in particular, in an approach to sort of reversing focusing more on land and indigenous policy.
Yeah, this is a conversation that I have sometimes with my grad students. I say we should solve global poverty, and they say no, the climate is more immediate. And I feel like you're not going to solve climate change if you don't solve global poverty. You know what I mean? If the question is, does my child eat tomorrow, or the climate is in 20 years, it's always going to be my child eats tomorrow. You know, so I agree that Rina said. War is not good for global poverty, ecological crisis is not good for war, and global poverty is not good for ecological crisis. So they all have to be solved at the same time, and solving one means helping to solve the other as well. Do you two want to say anything about this?
Well, I just like the point, one of the points you made, which is, I think that's another thing sociologists can do is articulate and analyze and utilize indigenous knowledge like that. That will. I guess I'm trying to think of what can sociologists do to participate in this career, and I think oftentimes we criticize it and poo-poo it and stay away from it. And if we're kind of slightly interested in participating in it in some other way, I think what you raised about bringing in indigenous knowledge would be fascinating, especially in engagement with these other kinds of, like I call it, expert knowledge. And I do think the sort of movement or the wave of the environmental movement is an amazing opportunity where it's finally not considered as wacko to look at indigenous knowledge, because in fact they might have something to say about land and sustainability and future and health and all of it. So I also will just add on war. I think it's an interest. I agree with Beverly that we don't actually for some reason look at war in traditional development circles. But I think the one area that's making it come into development circles is refugees. So because we used to think of refugee, we even legalized this weird categorical difference between refugees and economic migrants. Development people look at economic migrants, and humanitarian people look at refugees. And obviously they're very, very connected. And war, I think, is helping that awareness, just like the environmental movement, I think, can be used to an advantage.
Thank you to Monica, Rina, and Beverly. I enjoy growing up in the University of Toronto, and my comment is much less lofty than the prior commenters, and it's about what this center might be useful for. So, looking around the room, our unique skills are as academic researchers, and often we operate as lone wolves, although we have a lot of shared interests. And I'm wondering if one thing that the Center on Global Poverty might be able to do is to help us come together as research collaborators, in addition to just bringing us physically here together in the room. But if there isn't a way for those of us with shared interests to collaborate together on research projects, and if the center might be, as you called it, a nodal agency for fostering those collaborations.
Well, one thing we were thinking of doing is they've actually set this room up really nicely for doing breakout groups. So if we could spend just 10 minutes in your at your tables, if you could discuss this issue of what could the Johns Hopkins Center of Global Poverty do that would make you really excited, that would make you want to come to Baltimore, to DC, to participate in this center, and how could it help you in your efforts, how could it sort of help you orient your efforts in this direction. So we went to the administrators and said, we're so excited, we've got the center, and they said, okay, so this is what you do for 2 years, you discuss it. So this is the time to get involved in the center. For the next couple of years, we're going to be doing workshops and trying to figure out what we're actually doing, so this is the time to do it. So if you just spend 10 minutes in a breakout group thinking about this, and then we will come back and kind of talk at a broader level about this.
For the graduate students in the room, letting them do dissertations that would allow them to solve problems, so they've got a wide choice of jobs where they could get out that would allow them to implement problems that they were able to develop while doing their thesis.
So the problem to be solved is how to get recruitment committees to hire problem solvers.
Or help graduate students get solutions.
Or help graduate students publish papers in ways that speak to the discipline, even if the discipline isn't specifically about problem solving. Yeah, so dissertation workshops.
Here are two out-of-the-box ideas, one of which is that some part of what you do is the narrative storytelling that makes things come alive for populations and convinces care. There was a sociologist who just came to see what's called the anti-child labor movement in the United States through photographic exhibitions. And so one suggestion was that either by programming it into conditions of some of the grants you might give or researches you might circulate, or by just kind of making some sort of thing like that available, a specific grant, to having a public-facing, accessible narrative component, whether it's photographs or something else that translates your research into a populace facing thing. And then the other idea was we didn't fully solve what to call it, but essentially that sociologists have this language gap in how we think. We're so problems focused in how we think about what to research and what the outputs of our research are. It's really hard to overcome that. And also that people around the world who might want a sociologist don't have access to them the way that you have embedded economists all around the world in issues of finance. And so facilitating some sort of borrow a sociologist program that help like deprogram the sociologists, get us closer to the nitty gritty on the ground, what it is actually like, make us confront the brokenness of our problem-centered schema so that we try to onboard more problem solving, and also get us closer to the local problem so we can do this sort of localized, some sort of customized in situ, administratively and politically practical problem solving for groups, maybe by facilitating connection, by making it visible, maybe by making it more cost efficient to lower income municipalities, agents who might want access to that.
So if you've got a group with a problem, you call Johns Hopkins, we put you in touch with a sociologist, and this actually, it gets the sociologist on the ground as well, probably helps them do their problem solving dissertation.
Yes, in our table we discussed three things. First of all is funding. Because no matter what happened, funding will be important for any type of research, particularly for this type of problem solving things. So if the center can either curate ways of funding available that can help researchers doing their research on the ground, that'd be awesome. The second one is to build some service resource collections for both researchers and policymakers if they wanted to solve certain type of problem. And it's really hard right now to just go to the library and try to find and read everything. Maybe we can have kind of like annotated bibliography or a list of collections sorted by topics posted at the center's website. That would be helpful for both world's experts. And the third thing is that we are talking about very interesting discussions on, instead of waging war against other disciplines like economists and things, is it possible to start initiating the bridging program where we can influence the good things from sociology to outside of disciplines and maybe take something good back that can help us create innovative approaches for problem solving?
Thank you. Other thoughts or other conversations that you had?
Yeah, on the idea that to solve global poverty, we actually have to connect with the people who are doing it, the practitioners, the policymakers. Some good ideas out there. We also were talking about research funding, but the problem is that, especially for people more junior in the field, its academic incentives are completely aligned against collaborating and having policy relevant work that's not going to get published in a journal. So this is also not a solution, but how can this center find ways to make those connections so that, because you publish a bibliography, policymakers are not going to read it, and they're not going to know about it. How do we make that connection so that we can translate things directly to them or work directly with them without, within the concurrent incentive structure?
Well, one of the goals of this entire conference was to get practitioners and researchers in the same room. So Laura, you're here, so we have accomplished this goal.
This just came to me as people were talking, but on this point about people talk about the academic, non-academic, but I'm also wondering whether it might be useful for the center to be a connection to the media, and if we also want to try and somehow infiltrate the media, like so, deals like say for example the Financial Times, they often contact economists as an expert person as one of their articles, maybe the New York Times. That just maybe the center can be a way to reach out to journalists, they can also reach out to you if there's particular experts, sociologists that we want to quote. But yeah, maybe just also thinking about sort of establishing sociologists as development experts in culture.
Yes.
Yes, I think in our table we decided that I think training the students and as scholars without, to do research, not just the traditional way of doing research, but people-oriented research, grassroots-oriented research, and research that will really bring you into immersion with poor and marginalized sectors of society. So that there is, like American universities, how can we link with and let's say movements in the global south? And I'm trying to start an institute for Philippine studies, human rights and sustainability that will be doing this kind of research, participatory research, empowering research, grassroots-oriented research that will bring sociologists and other disciplines, I'm glad you used that, to solving the issues. Global poverty is multifaceted. And then we need really the other disciplines, environmental scientists, economists, maybe we should include also philosophers, and being active also in social movements. You learn a lot when you have grassroots people coming together collectively to resist the other policies, structural adjustment policies that I heard today, neoliberal policies. We need a movement to do that. And I think with all the resources American universities have, we are not channeling it to the right place.
We have time for just a couple more comments if anyone wants to. Yes.
Yeah, so we can, the center can collaborate with UN agencies like UNDP or IOM. They deal with the migrations and the development, and it's a really good source to collaborate with the government, the local government. And they can know or they can understand the actual problem because they deal with the human population. And also I would like to add with her like vocational training and skill development for the grad student, and also the data sharing. To get proper data is really tough and challenging sometimes. So to create or to have MOU with UN agencies or maybe with other universities, that would be a great decision. Yeah.
It seems to me that we're trying to change things. One of the reasons we're having trouble is because the prevalent consensus is neoliberal, Reaganism, market fundamentalism. Let the market decide. In order to overcome that, we have to understand That's the problem. It's not us, it's them. And we have to frame them in a way that reveals them to be what they are, which is greedy sons of bitches. If you'll pardon the expression.
And one last comment.
Our table, we actually talked about like how may we actually integrate undergrad students who are actually this generation, they are doers, they really want to deal with things into this kind of center. Together with that kind of grad student, but also junior scholars and social movement practitioners. And you know, I just find it's, that would be one way to think about how to bring different kind of people together. And also take the best use of the location in DC. Maybe think about working with some like that kind of level institution, global development institution, and also students oftentimes find it's just so intrigued to be able to get that academic training, but meanwhile get that kind of practical training, especially for undergrad students. We also actually talk about the subfield as development sociology or sociology of development, how we actually identify ourselves and how we actually educate our, other peers, even among sociologists. I just find that kind of, bridge, and I'm hopeful this center may able to, emphasize our, identity in the subfield and our contribution in sociology as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to leave the conversation there for now, but we will be continuing this conversation over the next few years. If you want to be involved with the center, please email me. We have this list going. We are now going to take a break for lunch, which is in the back room, and also the terrace is going to be open, so please take advantage of it. There's gorgeous views from this building. Thank you, everyone.